All right, a few weeks ago I made a video titled Ukraine's Great Patriotic War, and I think as most of you realize that's not a subtle play on words because within Russia and the other former Soviet republics, World War II is referred to as the Great Patriotic War. And I've talked about this a couple times, like within the United States, World War II is one of the foundations of the civic social contract. You know, we have like the original civic religion of the United States, which is based on like the founding fathers and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the American Revolution. And then we have a more modern one based on a more interventionist federal government, a more powerful federal government. And there's a long history there. It certainly didn't begin with World War II. That's not where it started by any means, but that's where it gets most of its legitimacy. So even when you have somebody who's like an anti-war liberal, like say Michael Moore, he'll be asked, well, isn't the government bad at doing things? Isn't the government inefficient? Isn't it better to have private businesses? One of the first things that many of them will say, well, what about World War II? World War II was great. And I've made many videos kind of, I don't know if you could call it revisionist, but looking at World War II with a critical eye and saying there were many mistakes made. There were many things that don't cast the United States in an amazing light that are worth remembering and worth knowing about. But I think it's fair to say that as important as World War II is in the zeitgeist of the United States, it's vastly more important in Russia. In Russia, it is absolutely the one thing that they can point to and say, this is what was good about the USSR. And this kind of came to mind. I'll put a link in the description. There was an excellent documentary made by DW, the Deutsche World, the German language, although they do in English as well. This is a documentary. I'll put the link, but the title is Russia, a Small Town Clings to Its Soviet Past, DW documentary. Now, this was filmed before the war in Ukraine. This was filmed in 2019. And it basically follows a few people in this town called Yelna in the former Soviet Union in Russia. And these people, many of them are just ultra-nationalistic, ultra-patriotic. And it follows this one particular girl who's very patriotic. She says, that's my thing, I'm patriotic. And she does these little competitions where she dresses up in these little mock military uniforms and sings like a singing competition. But of course, the things that you sing about are the glories of war, the glories of patriotism, that sort of thing. And what was interesting was she finishes singing, and one of the judges tells her to stop. You know, she starts to walk off the stage, and he says, "Stop! Don't leave yet." And he said, "You know, you stand out because it sounds like you really know what you're singing about." And he started quizzing her about the Great Patriotic War. And he's like, "You know, do you know how long the war lasted?" And she says 1941 to 1945. And then he goes, "Do you know when it started?" And she says 1941. And he goes, "Do you know the date?" And she goes, June 22nd. Now, of course, June 22nd is a famous date. And if you're going to be roughly conversant in history, it's good for you to know that June 22nd, 1941 is the date that Operation Barbarossa began. That's the date that the German combined forces, including Finnish forces, Hungarian forces, launched this massive invasion of the Soviet Union, the most massive invasion that's ever happened in the history of the world. And so it was good for her to remember that date. But I remember thinking, well, hold on a second. World War II didn't start on June 22nd, 1941, and it didn't start for the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And as important as revisionism is in the United States, and it's very important to look at the provocations that the FDR administration was delivering against both the Germans and the Japanese. It's very important to look at the stupidity of things like the unconditional surrender mandate, which made it much more difficult for the Axis to do anything other than fight to the bitter end. You know, especially true in the case of Japan, where they said, you need to unconditionally surrender. They kept asking, can we surrender and keep the emperor? And they kept saying no. Until the final, after they nuked two cities and hundreds of thousands of people died needlessly, they said, okay, fine, you can surrender. And they let them keep the emperor anyway. And Hirohito sat on the throne until 1989 when he died. His son is still the emperor as of right now. But it's much more necessary in Russia. And because Russia is in a war right now, a war that actually has quite a few very interesting parallels with the past, I think it's very important that Russia have a revisionist history as well. So two things pop out. First, that there was a major war, which people don't often consider part of World War II, but it happens parallel to it and is completely involved, and that is the so-called Winter War of 1939 between the USSR and Finland. I'm sure most of you have heard about this war. Basically, and maybe I should, this is related to another thing that you're not supposed to talk about with Russia, right? We're supposed to look at the Soviet Union. The analogies, the Soviet Union is this great country. It liberated Europe. It was attacked. And if you're from Russia, if you're from the USSR, you should be proud of the history there. Maybe not so much, and that's what I want to go into. And of course, it's a big state. It was a big war. A lot of things happened, and I can't go into everything, but I just want to outline a couple major points that aren't revisionism, because everybody knows, I guess, unless you've been prescribed from knowing about it, that these things happen. So probably I should start not with the Winter War. I'll tie that in, but the first thing, the original sin of the Soviet Union is the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty. Okay, so maybe you've never heard of this, maybe you have. It would be very difficult to overestimate the importance of this pact. Ribbentrop was the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, of the Third Reich. Molotov was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, the new foreign minister of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a Jewish foreign minister before that by the guy by the name of Litvinov. He was Jewish, and in order to kind of curry favor with Hitler, Stalin dismissed him, threw him in the gulag for a little while. He would come back later and instituted a guy named Molotov. And Molotov is, by the way, the person whose name gave itself to the Molotov cocktails, an interesting parallel with contemporary history there. Hitler wanted to invade Poland. He wanted to invade Poland to take Danzig and a corridor to Danzig, and he was quite nervous because there had been a war guarantee given to Poland by France and the UK, and that he would be involved in a war against the Poles, who were definitely going to fight, whatever their shortcomings. They still had a large army and a lot of territory, and they seemed quite ready to fight. And then, of course, the French and the English each, roughly had parity with the UK or with Germany, stronger in some areas, weaker in others. And this was going to potentially be a very, very bad situation. What would make it even worse would be if the Soviet Union had also entered into the conflict. If the Germans invaded Poland and the Soviets came to their aid or joined the war, then they would have been involved in a war on two fronts where they couldn't readily win. On the Eastern Front, it's simply too large. And Hitler was desperate to come to some kind of arrangement with the Soviets. If you read some of the English dispatches at this time, Lord Halifax basically saying Hitler sounds like he's absolutely desperate for something. And he started talking at the very end of August. The war starts on September 1st. There's all these back and forth of diplomatic developments all through August, and indeed for the preceding period, basically saying, well, maybe I have to have Danzig, but maybe we could give the Poles something else, give them access someplace else. Maybe he needs Prussia, just some kind of trade, because he was very worried about a war. Not that he wasn't warlike, not that he wasn't willing to fight a war, not that he wasn't an aggressive monster. I'm not saying any of that. But he also wasn't an idiot, whatever people want to say about him. And the prospects of having this massive war on two fronts with basically all the countries of Europe, all the major countries anyway, other than himself, really bothered him. And yet, they started talking to the Soviet Union, and he basically is begging them to sign a pact, a non-aggression pact. And sure enough, Ribbentrop flies to Moscow, and the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact is signed, I believe, on August 27th. And Germany invades, 4 days later on September 1st? Now, it would be difficult counterfactually to say that if the Soviets hadn't signed that pact, that the war might not have happened, right? Hitler may still have invaded. There's this process when you mobilize troops where at a certain point it's very hard to pull it back, right? It's either do they have to go or they don't. And I think that, and it's been a while since I've read about this in significant detail, but they had something like a 1 or 2 day where if they couldn't just decide the day of, hey, you got to stop. Um, the wheels were in motion. They had made the plans. It's likely that they were going to invade either way, but it's not certain. He seemed quite desperate at the end to reach some kind of an accord, and he did reach an accord with the Soviet Union, and they made an agreement. They hammered out spheres of influence, and basically the Germans said, okay, Russia, you can have the Baltic, you can have Finland, and you can have more than half of Poland. Right, and this is not some small thing. The Germans have a lot of history in the Baltic. There's a lot of Baltic Germans. A lot of the Baltic states, Lithuania and Latvia especially, had been Teutonic areas that have been part of East Prussia at one point or another. And Hitler said, yeah, thus all your sphere of influence. The Baltic, Finland, more than half of Poland. And Molotov put a signature to it. They had other things too, that they would exchange military technology for resources. Basically, the Soviets promised to provide Germany with all the oil it needed, all the rubber it needed. Soviet Union didn't produce rubber, but they had access to rubber from the Far East that they could then ship there. Obviously, oil, natural gas, things that they had in huge abundance. They could supply with the Germans. The Germans didn't really have enough on their own, among a whole bunch of other things, manganese, nickel, steel, the whole 9 yards, grain, fats, animals, right? And then the Germans promised to exchange military hardware technology, right? Because the Russians are always behind technologically. So I don't think it would be unfair to say that the Soviet Union unleashed Hitler, right? They definitely made it possible for him to invade Poland in a way that he couldn't have really done otherwise, and he was afraid to do otherwise. And so this girl's innocent belief is just as erroneous as it is innocent, right? The war started on September 1st, and Russia has blood all over its hands for that. You know, and when I talk about the United States, we'll talk about FDR, and the big debate is, did he provoke Japan? You know, the oil embargo, the moving of the base from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, the creation of fighter forces, submarine forces in the Philippines, right? All these things. You can look it up. The McCullen memo, you know, he asked the Office of Naval Intelligence to come up with a list of things that would make Japan mad, things that would potentially provoke Japan to war, and they implemented, I think, all of them or almost all of them. But still, they're not encouraging Japan to go to war. I mean, you could say that they are in the fact that they're giving them sanctions, right? But they're telling them, don't go to war. They're trying to stop them from going to war. The Soviets wanted Germany to go to war. And this is very clear if you read Kotkin's book, The History of Stalin, that in his ideology, this would be perfect. You can have the Western powers fight each other, they'll destroy each other, and then we can walk in later and take our pick, right? Take whatever we want of Europe because they'll be devastated. It'll be just like World War I, except Russia won't be involved. There'll be this trench warfare that will last 4 or 5 years, and they'll bleed each other dry, and then we can just step in. And if I can help make that happen by signing a non-aggression pact with Germany, then that's what I'll do, and that's indeed what they did. And they were quite cowardly about it. They waited for the Germans to essentially destroy almost all of the Polish army. The Polish army didn't have a very good plan when it came to war. They tried to defend all of their borders, which were just not defensible. The Germans were attacking from 3 different sides, from East Prussia, from Germany itself, and from Czechoslovakia that had just been absorbed into Germany a few months, about a year earlier. Well, March 39, March 38, I can't remember what year. But even so, the Poles were willing to fight, and they regrouped east of Warsaw in the eastern part of the country, parts that are now part of Ukraine and part of Belarusia, actually. And on September 17th, 1939, the Russians invaded Poland from the east and completely destroyed any chance of the Polish making a substantive last stand. Not that that last stand would have been very effective in the long run, but just completely just walked into the country. And of course, there wasn't a ton of resistance because the Polish army wasn't expecting this. It came right out of the blue. But the Russians took casualties. So the idea that, you know, Russians only started dying in June, on June 22nd, 1941, is completely false. And the way they started dying is because they aggressively invaded Poland, a country that was fighting for its life at the moment against Nazi Germany. And as I've said a couple times, they waited for the Germans to destroy as much of the Polish army as they could. They waited for the Germans to occupy to surround Warsaw and to occupy the parts of the Poland that had been agreed would be part of the German sphere of influence, and then they invaded. Quite mendacious, really. And then proceeded to murder 500,000 Polish people, Polish officers, Polish non-communists, Catholics. Now, the Germans did this too, right? The Germans went after Jews, the Germans went after strong anti-Nazis, and the Germans probably killed something like 100 and 150,000, right? Oh, that's really bad. But the Russians killed 500,000, 500,000 Poles, right? So people wonder why the Poles hate Russians so much. Like, well, they have very good reason to, right? 500,000. And then the Poles, right? So the Soviet Union's guilt here, as much as I hate FDR, as much as I think FDR is a liar, right? The title of the best book on his foreknowledge is called The Day of Deceit. And I'm not 100% on his foreknowledge, by the way. I don't know for sure. I think that he did. I think it's likely, but I can't prove it. He definitely wanted a war. Thaddeus Russell says he's uncovered research that his very first time he was as president, like the very first cabinet meeting he had, or maybe the second cabinet meeting back in 1933, he asked the cabinet how they could go to war with Japan. So there was something about FDR where he really wanted to go to war with Japan. So fuck that guy. He was a liar, right? So, Americans should analyze our history and learn from that. But that does not even... That is so inconsequential in comparison with what the Soviet Union did regarding World War II. They literally unleashed Hitler, and then they helped, right? They invaded Poland. They eliminated its last bastion of resistance, and then began to systematically slaughter its intelligentsia, its cultural heroes. Anyone who couldn't escape to the West was completely fucked. And then what did they do? Then they occupied all three of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They just marked in and said, you're going to sign a treaty letting us in, let us put military bases in there, and within a week or two you're going to be absorbed into the Soviet Union. And if you don't like it, you can just ask the Germans what they think about it, and the Germans are going to say it's fine, which they did. Okay. Now Finland was also in their sphere of influence, and so in early November 1939, the Russians summoned a Finnish delegation to Moscow, and they said, "This is what's going to happen. You're going to sign a lease. You're going to give us a bunch of islands in the Gulf of Finland. You're going to give us military bases right outside Helsinki. You're going to give us a bunch of land on the Karelian Isthmus." So the Karelian Isthmus is a strip of land, a foresty, swampy piece of land that kind of... Isthmus is a strip of land that's surrounded by water on two sides. And in this case, it's the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, which is this massive lake. This isthmus goes very close to St. Petersburg, and the border of Finland with St. Petersburg was something like 25 or 30 miles, right? So it's very, very close. And the Russians were very, very nervous about this. So like, you're going to give us the Karelian Isthmus, you're going to allow us to put military bases in the Gulf of Finland, and also on mainland Finland, right by Helsinki. You're going to give us land up by Petsamo. And, Stalin said, I'll give you land that's in the middle of nowhere, forested land that's worthless, that has no strategic value, and I'll give you more land than I'm taking, twice as much, but it's completely worthless land, right? It's like, oh, if you give me New York and LA, I'll give you, Baffin Island. Okay, no, that's not. California for Baffin Island's not a fair trade. Scale there different, but you get the idea. And the Finns said no. No dice. The Finns knew exactly what was going on. They knew this isn't all the Soviets were going to take. This is the nose under the camel's nose under the tent, and they said no. And there was about a month through the month of November 1939 where the Soviets kept asking for more and more. They came down on some things. They said, oh, the base where we wanted 5,000 soldiers right outside Helsinki, now we'll settle for only 4,000 soldiers. Nope. So at the end of November, the Soviets invaded Finland, and begins the Winter War. So you can say the Winter War is not part of World War II, or you could say that it is. I would say it definitely is. It's coming because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, non-aggression pact, and it's directly related. And what followed is one of the most heroic examples of a very small country. The population of Finland at the time was 3 million. The population of the USSR was something like 170, 180 million. Which, by the way, is more than Russia is right now. See how does this sound familiar? A massive Russian state attacking a much smaller peripheral state in the winter and it not going very well. Except in this case, it was a much smaller state and it went a lot worse because the Russians lost about 125 to 165,000 dead, a quarter million to 350,000 casualties. They lost thousands of tanks, thousands of planes, thousands of tanks. I don't know about thousands of planes, and eventually, through weight of numbers, they were able to take what they wanted, but the cost was so high and so disastrous. Everyone in the world, by the way, came to the Finns' aid. Hungary, Romania, Germany, Sweden, Norway, even the United States. The things that the American Congress was saying regarding to Finland is almost exactly to what we're hearing right now regarding Ukraine. The number of parallels is actually stunning. Now, Ukraine isn't as inhospitable as Finland is, so the casualties are, a tenth what they were in that, or maybe a little bit more. We actually don't know what the casualties are in the current war, so who's to say for sure. But the Soviet Union eventually got what it wanted, but it was such a disaster that they never invaded Finland again, and Finland was able to keep its independence ever since then, basically a neutral independence. By the way, to bring it back to contemporary times, Finland now wants to join NATO, and Russia is threatening them, and Finland is saying, go ahead, bring it on. And just like last time, the Russian Federation now is far weaker, relatively speaking, than the Soviet Union was back then. Back then, Finland was a new state. It's got probably double the population now that it did then, and it's actually technologically more advanced. So it would be, a very different war, probably not in a good way. But suffice to say, the Soviet Union took, over 100,000 dead, more like 150,000 dead. It was at least 125,000 dead, up to 160,000 dead, and twice that many wounded, mostly from frostbite. Okay, so it's not like the violence only started on June 22nd, 1941. You've already had the most humiliating defeat ever, almost. It's up there. Russia has a couple of these. Their defeat against Japan in 1905, the Winter War. They had a couple really humiliating defeats where they just thought they'd walk all over somebody and just got their ass handed to them. So, if we're going to talk about the glories of the USSR and the Great Patriotic War, let's talk about the 500,000 dead Poles. And if you don't want to talk about them, you better damn well be sure that people in Poland know about that and they think about it. And that's why they're so gung-ho on the Ukrainian side in this, right? That's why Finland is so gung-ho on the Ukrainian side, right? And it's like, well, we edit our history in Russia, but you got to know people outside Russia don't edit it. So, there's 2 points there. There's a couple other points that I think are worth mentioning. Another one, the number. So Operation Barbarossa, deservedly considered one of the biggest military operations in history, starts June 22nd, 1941. The Germans invade with roughly 3 million troops, right? So this dwarfs, if you look at the Russians invaded Ukraine with 120,000, so what is that, like a 125th what the Germans invaded the USSR with in 1941? Absolute catastrophe, right? The Soviets lose millions of soldiers killed, captured, destroyed. Entire Soviet armies were wiped out almost on a weekly basis throughout the war. There are several battles in this war that are famous for being the highest casualties and the highest prisoner counts. So the most prisoners ever taken, usually attributed to the Battle of Kiev. And I think in September of 1941, the Germans took 600,000 Soviet prisoners. 600,000. And you have to ask yourself, 600,000 is a lot of men. That's a big area. And to have them give up in mass. Look at what's happening in Mariupol right now, where you have, a few thousand Ukrainians who are still fighting, even though they really have no realistic hope of being reinforced. Maybe some of them might be able to sneak away, but there's probably not going to be any kind of relief coming. They're still fighting, right? Imagine if there were 600,000 of them, right? Would you think they would all just give up? It's absolutely astounding. Whether it's a combination of military incompetence or just sheer morale, right? The Soviet Union had been around for a while now, and so many of its soldiers looked at it like, you know what, I'd rather just fucking give up. I don't want to fight for them. And this became quite an embarrassment throughout the rest of the war. I believe the Germans took several million, 4 or 5 million prisoners. where if you look at how many American prisoners did they take, 70,000, 80,000, and most of them were pilots and bombers that got shot down. Now, granted, it's a different scenario. They're invading the USSR. There wasn't a lot of major land campaigns with American forces, or British forces for that matter. But still, it's absolutely embarrassing, right, how bad the Soviet army did. And people want to give Stalin, I always hear the leftists be like, the Holodomor was bad, the oppression was bad, but it was good because the Soviet Union was able to industrialize, and that industrialization allowed them to, quote, win the war. He also liquidated all of his officer corps, right? He did a great purge in the Great Terror in 1937, where he just killed a huge percentage of the military elite, which, to be fair, I mean, they had a fairly, I don't want to say progressive, but they seemed to be they were into scientific military. They weren't bound by a lot of the traditions that were kind of hobbling a lot of the European armies and the American army to an extent, and they really believed in mechanization, and so they had more tanks, they had more planes, they had a very modern army in a lot of senses. And then he essentially decapitated it. And then when he tried to invade Finland, and it was such a catastrophe, the Germans took one look at that and said, if 100,000 Finnish soldiers can do that, I wonder what 3 million Germans can do, right? And it turns out they could do an awful fucking lot, right? And as Solzhenitsyn has said, if this is victory, it's worse than any defeat that's ever happened in terms of the casualties, in terms of the destruction. And you had, again, millions of Soviet soldiers who just gave up en masse. There's no way 600,000 soldiers are just helpless. And this was happening, 10,000, 50,000. And were there examples who fought on? Yeah, absolutely there were. There absolutely were. Not everyone in the Soviet Union was a coward, but a lot of people hated the Soviet government enough that they're like, I'm not going to die for Stalin. I'm not going to die for the Communist Party. I'd rather just give up. And so bad that many of them ended up fighting for the Germans. The Germans were able to go to these prisoners and recruit them and form military units. And so another name that you all should remember when you're talking to a Russian bot is the name of General Vlasov. Let me get his full name, General Vlasov. So General Vlasov was a Soviet general. He helped defend Moscow in the winter of 1941. He was listed as one of the generals who helped save the city, but he got captured in a pocket early in 1942 and ended up turning to the Germans and commanding a couple 100,000 Russian prisoners. Yeah, Andrei Vlasov. And again, what a heroic guy to go against Stalin, right? He's fighting for Hitler. Okay, but that's who you got to pick, the lesser of two evils. Hitler is the lesser of the two evils. Easy choice in that case. And there were no American generals who joined the Germans. There were no British generals who joined the Germans. There were no French generals other than becoming the Vichy head of government, but they didn't actively fight for the Nazis, at least not outside like the colonies. I mean, we can get into the Vichy French colonies in Syria or whatnot, but nothing on the scale of this. And it was an embarrassment, which is why before the war was over, Stalin basically told the Western Allies, when you guys liberate the West, I want all of the Russians back. I want you to repatriate every Russian soldier, even people who had left the Soviet Union before the war started, white emigres. And these soldiers, these emigres, were reinterned. Many of them were killed. Thousands of them were killed. Maybe millions of them were killed even. A good book, by the way, on that. The Secret Betrayal, 1944 to 1947, by Nikolai Tolstoy. I did a review on this years ago, so if you look back in my channel, probably if you just search that title, you'll find it. By the way, Tolstoy is like the great nephew of the famous Leo Tolstoy. He's British, though. I think their family fled during the revolution. But it was embarrassing, right? It was embarrassing that many Soviets would surrender, and not just surrender, but choose to fight for the Germans. Right? It's something that didn't happen. American GIs were not going to take up arms against the United States, and they didn't do it. Neither did the British, neither did the French. But the fucking Soviets absolutely did. Then the other thing, it's not like they did this all alone. Now, when I was a little kid, I had this idea that the Americans won the war single-handedly, and that was obviously ridiculous. But I think a lot of Russians seems to still think that. And there's a couple reasons why this is stupid. One, uh, the reason Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and a lot of people get this wrong, they think he invaded the Soviet Union because he wanted a Lebensraum and he wanted to build this Eastern European empire. And that's partially correct. If you read Mein Kampf, it's in there. He talks about it. He definitely saw this as a chance to build a United States of Germany, basically. But that's not why he launched the war. I mean, when he invaded Poland, it wasn't with some grand idea to create this massive Third Reich with an Eastern European empire. It was because he was stalemated against the UK. Okay, so they go to war in 1939, invade Poland, successfully take Poland in 1940. They launch operations against Denmark and against Norway, which are successful but highly costly. Most of the German Navy is destroyed in the occupation of Norway. And then they invade the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And it's a very hard-fought battle, but they do win. France falls in a matter, I think, 6 or 9 weeks. It falls in June of 1940. And now Britain stands alone, right? There's no other countries fighting Germany at this point. And so Germany launches the so-called Battle of Britain, where he decides, okay, we're going to invade Britain. And to do that, we're going to, launch the Luftwaffe is going to attack every day. We're going to bomb, and we're going to destroy all their fighters. And once we destroy their fighters, then we're going to destroy their navy, and then we're going to invade. And the only problem was they couldn't do those things. The British already had an effective Air Force, the RAF. They had decided this was important by the mid-30s. They had the technical abilities and the resources to build a first-class Air Force, and they had indeed done so. The Luftwaffe was larger in absolute numbers, but the rates of production were higher. The British had more access to raw materials through their empire and through their maritime trade, which was massive. And so we were in a war of attrition where the British were producing more planes by a factor of, I think, 2 or 3 than the Luftwaffe, which means they're going to win. And indeed they did. Now, this doesn't mean that the UK was a juggernaut that was about to invade Europe, but the truth is that there was a true stalemate. The UK by itself was not going to be able to defeat Germany, at least in Europe. On the periphery, yes. And so we had a lot of fighting in Egypt, in Crete, in Greece, right? So again, later in the spring of 41, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia and then Greece. And while they were able to take these, the British fought very well. The Germans invaded Crete with a lot of paratroopers, and so many paratroopers were killed that they never did an airborne operation ever again. Very similar to their invasion of Norway. They were able to take Norway, but they basically lost most of their navy. They were able to take Crete. They decided never to do paratroopers ever again because the casualties were so high. There's lots of stories like New Zealand troops just shooting all the German soldiers as they, plummeted down to the runways. So we have Germany in a stalemate. They can't beat the UK. Even though the war has gone astoundingly well in many regards, they've still taken enormous losses. Lots of tanks, lots of planes, lots of men. It wasn't like the Poles were a pushover. It was effective, but the Germans took tens of thousands of casualties. They lost thousands of tanks. They lost planes, right? Just from the attrition of normal operations. And Hitler wasn't thinking, let's make Lebensraum. He was thinking, the only way to make the British give up is to take out the Soviets. If we take out the Soviets, they're going to lose hope. That right now, and he used the term sword. They think that the Soviet sword is there for them to pick up and to defeat us with. The other sword would be the American sword, but I guess he was hoping that would not get involved. America was very isolationist after all. And I don't say that in a derogatory way, but in an enlightened way. But he attacks the Soviet Union because he thinks it's the easiest way to beat Britain. Now think about that for a minute. What he's basically admitting here is he can't beat the UK, but he can beat the USSR. And I think it's fair to say they got close enough that it's conceivable that they might have won that war, right? Even though they had lost much of their air force in the battle with Britain, even though they had fewer tanks for Barbarossa than they had when they invaded Poland or when they invaded France. He was very impressed, by the way, Hitler, with the armored units. He ordered that the number of armored divisions be doubled for Operation Barbarossa. And they did double the number of divisions, but they had to have the number of tanks because they just could not build enough to overcome the losses that they'd had in these. I mean, these were major campaigns, right? Even though they were successful, they took massive losses. But I just think it's important for people to let that sink in. And by the way, I'm getting this from the 10-volume work, The History of Germany in World War II, that the German government wrote in the 80s. I read it in college. I didn't read the whole thing, but I did read up to this point. And it seems quite clear that they looked at it like the best way to beat UK is to beat the Soviet Union because we can. And of course, the fact that they had this huge debacle in Finland certainly helped in their calculations. And so that's what they proceed to do. And the thumping that the Soviets get is the worst thumping that any country's ever had in defeat or in victory, right? And here's the next thing. So they get invaded, and then immediately they get subsidized. They get subsidized by the British, who are fighting their own war magnificently well for the most part, but then begin subsidizing the UK. And then the Americans begin to subsidize the USSR. And it can't be overestimated how important this was. Basically, all of their trucks, right, came from the U.S. Machine tools, ammunition, small arms, motor engines, right? Everything that they have is a copy from the West, right? The T-34, the famous tank, it uses a Zeppelin engine from France, and it uses a tank chassis from the United States that the United States Army took a pass on, decided not to use, right? They're copies on those things. Everything that they had. And the amount of material that was given, I mean, people talk about now how much Ukraine is getting, how Ukraine is just, NATO is supplying Ukraine, and NATO is giving all this stuff. It's infinitesimal in comparison to what the Soviets were getting. And the idea, just the trucks alone, like Soviet trucks are junk. They don't run, right? They can't make a truck that can be roadworthy, even with the factories that they copied from Ford. I mean, they literally went and copied, like the River Rouge and the Zug Island plants in Michigan and Dearborn. They copied them in the Soviet Union and then copied Ford trucks. And the quality was so bad that they couldn't run. So they're getting American parts, American trucks, American expertise. Anthony C. Sutton, who's an economist from England but was at the Hoover Institute for a long time, he's most famous for a book called National Suicide, which kind of looks at this in the context of Vietnam, how the Gorky plant and these other plants in the Soviet Union were all copies of American plants. But his better work, less well known, is called Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, which is by far like the hardest book it's ever been for me to find and buy. It took me years and years. It's 3 volumes long. And when I was first looking at them back in the early 2000s, they were going for $1,500 a volume on Amazon. I think you could get the full set. I remember seeing it for $3,500. Eventually, I got it for cheaper than that, but it was not cheap. I think I spent $250 for volume 3, about $100 for volume 1, and about $150 for volume 2. Well, volume 2 is only about Lend-Lease. It's an entire book about the things that especially the United States, but also Great Britain, gave to the USSR in World War II. And, without trucks to do their logistics across, Ukraine and Belarusia, what we likely would have seen is that when Berlin is conquered by Eisenhower in the fall of 1945, the Russians are still somewhere on the Dnieper, right? They're not going to be in East Germany or Poland at that point because they don't have the logistics to do it. So they can take all this, glory us, but who's subsidizing who? Who's paying who? They're not giving us any support. We're giving them all the support. We're supporting ourselves and them, right? In this massive, massive, massive extent. That the stuff that's happening in Ukraine now is just like a shadow. It's the Sauron to the Morgoth in terms of comparison. The idea that this is their Great Patriotic War, they were the inferior, weaker ally that was astonishingly almost defeated and had to be put on life support from the West, from the capitalist powers, who had the wealth, had the technical expertise, and the will to fight, which, it has to be said again, many Soviets didn't have because they surrendered by the millions, right? And not all. Many of them did fight, and there was lots of glory. And I'm not going to say that every Soviet was a coward and that they didn't have, successes here and there. Of course they did. But the idea that they did all alone, again, they were invaded because there was a stalemate with the UK. Germany had already come to a point where it couldn't beat the UK. The best way for them to beat the UK was to invade Russia. And that's what they did. And they came fucking close, right? Also didn't hurt that the Allies by 1943, 1944 are just wiping out German cities with mass air attacks, right? And if we want to talk about, history, we should talk about that. But like, what side is filling the air with state-of-the-art four-engine bombers that the Russians can't even build, which is, again, hilarious because, at the start of World War I, Russia had the second largest air force in the world, and it was the only country in the world that had strategic bombers. It was the only country in the world that had four-engine bombers that could fly, hundreds of miles and drop a payload. The best, most powerful bombers in World War I were built in Russia. And the Soviet Union just lobotomized their industry so much that they didn't have shit when it came to World War II. And eventually they had to just copy B-29s. Now they weren't able to copy them in the war, so they didn't have B-29s in the war. They just copied them after the war. A couple of B-29s had to land in Russia after bombing Japan, and Stalin had them copied right down to the fact that the B-29 uses imperial measurements where the Soviets used metric, so they had to retool everything to build it exactly like the way Stalin said, because he said make an exact copy. But that subsidy was, they bitch about what happens in Ukraine now. It was nothing compared to what they got in World War II, not even remotely close. Yeah, there's a lot for them to be. And this is the sad thing. It's fine to look and draw inspiration. It's fine to study the history and be like, okay, here's something we can learn. But you have to also analyze and be like, this is what we did wrong. These are the problems. This is what's sad. This is where mistakes were made. But if you're just going to whitewash it all as a glorious string of impeccable victories, then you're fucking stupid. Now, in thinking about this piece or video or whatever you call it, I came across this. Here, I'll put a link to this. Putin signed the law on fines for identifying the roles of the USSR and Nazi Germany. So you are not allowed to talk about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The law is titled, in July 2021, the law, quote, on perpetuating the victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War of 1941-45, so I guess we're just omitting 39 and 40 there, was adopted. And there's massive fines, and you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to mention that they signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, right? They're going to talk about the Azov Battalion because of their flags and because they committed some fucked up murders at some point. Okay, fair enough. But Molotov signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler and then executed 500,000 Poles after they invaded Poland and the Baltics and tried to fucking invade Finland and got their teeth kicked in. It makes you think that the Baltics probably should have tried harder too. So they're just going to stay ignorant of that, but then they're not going to understand the way people in the Baltics and Poland think about them, or the people in the Ukraine who don't live under this law and can talk about it and know that all of this happened, right? You're just being an idiot. Like, and I not that I was there, would I want to dunk on some fucking teenage girl who's just trying to win a singing contest? This is a good documentary. Again, I'll put links to it. It's fascinating to watch. But like, this is completely insane, right? You should learn from your history, not mythologize it and then take all the wrong lessons, which is what they're doing in some massive sense. I'll put a link to this. It's in Russian, but you can get it translated. On perpetuating the victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic. And here's the meta point. So in Russia today, we do have true, like, Soviet apologists, true communists who are like, they believe in communism. They want to bring back the Soviet Union. Okay. So those people, obviously, they need to answer, okay, well, what about the Holodomor? What about the gulags? What about the Soviet Ribbentrop Pact? All these things. Go on and on and on. I mean, more than going back to Lenin, all that stuff. But that's not what Putin is. Putin is not a true communist, right? There's these other Russian nationalists who aren't communists. They say they're not communists. A lot of them don't like communism. They'll bitch and be like, "Wow, Lenin is terrible because he created the administrative unit of the Ukraine, and that's awful because Ukraine doesn't really exist because it's not like it's a separate language, right?" Um, but okay, so are we? But then those same people who are saying I'm not a communist and I don't believe in the Soviet Union, why are they talking about the Great Patriotic War? Right? Why are they saying we liberated Europe and we defeated Hitler? We, as if the UK and the United States had nothing to do with it. Um, okay, but that's the Soviet legacy. So you can't just it's just it'd be like when we talk about the U.S. and World War II, like, well, it's just about ending the Holocaust. Like, no, it's not just about that. You also have to know about the Japanese internment camps. You also have to know about the firebombing and the nuking of 2 cities in Japan and many in Germany. You have to look at all of it. You can't just pick the nice parts and then whitewash everything else. And so these non-Soviets, they got to find a way to own this better, because they're going and just being like, yeah, we defeated Hitler, and the Holodomor never really happened, and the Gulag wasn't that bad, and there were a lot of kulaks that were pretty not, we're just punishing Nazis. Everyone who was against the Soviet Union is a Nazi. Those 500,000 Poles, Nazis. All those people in the Baltics, they were Nazis. Those fucking Finns who were never part of the Third Reich and had been part of Russia up until World War One, they were a bunch of Nazis too. And everyone in fucking Ukraine is a Nazi, and everyone's a Nazi. And we're completely innocent. And Vlasov is a Nazi. I guess you're not even supposed to say his name anymore. You're not supposed to talk about that guy like it never happened. You're not supposed to talk about the millions of Soviets who surrendered without a fight for the most part. Again, 600,000 in Kiev alone. That was just one example. Nope, not supposed to talk about that. Not supposed to talk how many died. We don't really even know even today. Like the official number, my whole life, it's always been 27 million, which... I mean, the United States lost 300,000. Germany lost 4 million. Japan lost 4 million. The UK lost like 100,000 or 300,000, right? Like the UK and France, World War I was worse than World War II in terms of the number of people died. I think France was like 1.5 million, and the UK was like 1 million in World War I. 27 million. That's the official number. And everything that I've read indicates it's probably more. It's probably more than that. And we're just never going to know. And they probably don't even know themselves. There's probably no full accounting. But, this is how, a state that was as or more populated than the United States in 1900 now has less than half the population of the United States now. Less than half. Demographic catastrophe. And nobody wanted to live there, so they didn't have immigrants to come fix it. Fix that. The American birth rate's not quite as high as it should be. We're not having as many kids as we should. We get enough immigrants that we can counteract that. We're one of the few countries that can do that, and amazing for a country that's this large, right? Soviet Union never had that. No one wanted to fucking live there, except for maybe some ideologues, some syndicalists and some communists, and half of them got wiped out in the purges anyway. Which, by the way, why there's a town in Ukraine called New York, which is right on the border. So it's possible the Russians are going to conquer New York at some point in the next couple of weeks. We will see. But, the British need revisionism. They need to talk about why did they give a guarantee to Poland and then do shit all to help Poland when they were in a fight for their lives. Same for the French. You don't give someone a war guarantee and then stand aside. The French and the French and the English should either not have given the guarantee, or having given it, they should have invaded Russia with 80 divisions right into the heartland of the Ruhr, where they make all of their war equipment, and they didn't do that. So they deserve a lot of blame. The Poles deserve some blame. The Poles ate up the partition of Czechoslovakia and Austria, right? Hitler, when he took those countries apart and gobbled them up, he didn't gobble them up all himself. He gave pieces of them to Poland. He goes, Poland, I'll give you some of this if you let it happen. Like, yeah, sure. Okay, well, if you're going to be one of the jackals on the kill, don't complain when the lion comes after you next. Okay, so not justifying everything that happened to Poland, but they have their own rapacious nationalism that got them into a lot of trouble. And the way that they treated Danzig was questionable, right? The whole thing, Treaty of Versailles, can't get into all that right now, but the book The War with Many Fathers goes into all of this really well. It's a very good book, and it doesn't absolve Hitler. Hitler's guilty as sin when it comes to World War II, but so are many others. But the Russians are like way up there in the guilt. Like they're way high in terms of they literally unleashed Hitler, and then they helped Hitler in massive ways. They invaded Poland, they executed, and when they took the Baltics, the first thing they did, they didn't actually go after the non-communists or the anti-communists in the Baltics. The first thing they did is try and get every single Polish guy who had ever escaped to the Baltics and try and kill them all, and they did. Right? And everyone in Poland knows that, which is why they're giving Ukraine all of their tanks, because they want as many Russians as possible to die, because Russians have made enemies all over the world, and they're just going to pretend like we're liberators. Well, no, you're not. People don't see you that way. You can see yourself that way, and you're just going to be delusional. You're the person, I don't know, walking down the street who thinks they're the toughest guy, the smartest guy, the best guy, when you're actually just a fucking punk. Everybody knows except for you. So, again, I've done plenty of videos on the United States. I'll do more. I just know more about it, and it's fascinating. But as much as I want to bitch and condemn and castigate FDR for being a horrible dictator, for being a liar, for being a cripple who lied about it, it's not bad that he's a cripple, but it's bad that he misled everybody to the extent, and especially his last term, he should not have been president. He could barely function at that point. He was such a power-hungry madman and such a liar. And it infuriates me when liberals who know that he was a liar, who know that principled people at the time from the right and the left hated his guts for good reason, still just hand-wave that he's the greatest guy ever, because the war started. And the fact that he began this massive rearmament without the war even beginning and gave us the military-industrial complex. Yeah, there's a lot of blood on his hands. He's the worst president that we've ever had, by far, in my opinion. And that's not even talking about the New Deal stuff. But if you add that, it's even worse. But if you compare him to what Stalin and Molotov did, he's like a Boy Scout. There's no comparison. He shoplifted some M&Ms from the store while they firebombed an entire city. That's about the relative difference in their, opprobrium there. So anyway, I recommend people to know this. I think if you're anywhere active online, on Twitter, wherever, you're going to be hearing a lot about Russians, this, that, and the other, about the Great Patriotic War. And it's good to know, that their hands are just completely soiled and bloody in this. And I mean as a nation. I don't mean as individuals. I would not blame somebody in Russia right now for the things Stalin or Molotov did. But if you're going to come around and start citing the history and saying, look at the glorious things and we're anti-Nazis. No, you signed a fucking non-aggression pact with Hitler. And then you invaded Poland and the Baltic, and you tried to invade Finland and got your ass handed to you. And then when you got invaded, your armies did so abysmal. They did so bad. They did so horrible. It was so horrendous that, maybe you shouldn't be so fucking proud about it. And you got to own it. There's another book called It All Happened a Long Time Ago. Or It Happened a Long Ago, and it never really happened, or something like that. And it's about, I've done a review on it, so you can look it up. But it's about the way the sins of the Soviet Union are seen in Russia today. And it's like, unlike in Germany, where eventually, and this didn't happen right away, but eventually Germans admitted, hey, this was a mistake, right? Oops, World War II, not so good. Maybe we can learn from that. And Americans need to do this too. And we've done this with other things, obviously with slavery and the Native Americans. We're happy to talk and even to dwell to an unhealthy extent in some cases, depending on the issue, on problems with the past. But the Russians seem really, really unable and unwilling to do that. And whether we're talking about the Soviet Union or we're talking about Catherine the Great, I can't get all these people talking about Novorossiya because she came in there and, genocided a bunch of Kalmyks and Turks that, somehow that means that Russia has the right to fucking take the Sea of Azov back. What a fucking joke. But anyway, Russia's Great Patriotic War. And I'll talk to you all soon.